We're ready.
Hello again. We're back. It's been a couple weeks, but we're back with our LinkedIn Live event. We got such a fun topic today. MedTech 401. Some folks who Adi Rembam, so wonderful to have you, Adi. I'm so excited. This is
Thank
going to be
you.
fun. We I w- so a funny story, just real quick for everybody. Dee and I recently met. Actually, we re-met. We were introduced by a close mutual friend of ours, Kim Norton, and some of you may remember Kim because we've done a couple other reimbursement events. So, Dee, first of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us, and it's so fun
You.
to reconnect with you after 20 plus years.
It has been a while. It's great to see you and to collaborate and it's great to be talking to a whole group of folks who have a lot of interest in this area.
Yeah. I think well, you and I are going to have fun with this, and hopefully the folks that join us today will get a lot out of it. Before we get started, just a couple of things. So, um, everybody that's joining us today, welcome. Thank you for joining us. If you have questions or comments or feedback or agree or disagree, feel free to drop it into comments. And if if it's specific questions or a intriguing thought. Provocative thought, Dee and I will talk about it. So the topic for today is reimbursement, MedTech Reimbursement 401, the advanced course. So Dee and I plan to kind of get into the weeds a little bit today um, around reimbursement, and then around reimbursement specifically as associated with launching a disruptive technology, because that's what we talk about on our LinkedIn Live. So. Adi, let's start here. So FDA clearance or authorization. And I love this. It's just not the finish line. I mean, I see this all the time. I want to hear your thoughts on this, but companies make this big celebration out of getting the FDA authorization, and it is a big deal. Oftentimes for companies that we work in the medtech space, it's years, you know, often millions of dollars and a lot of hard work.
Right. Right. But the reality is that the finish line for FDA is the starting line for your payer access strategy.
Yes.
And your payer access journey, I should say, because you will have started long before then, but hopefully, but it's really the beginning of your effort to reach the payers that are going to pay for your product, hopefully, and advocate in that community. And so it's really just the beginning. And and if you are at the FDA finish line and you're just starting to think about your payer strategy, you're going to need, you should have been at the 101 course.
Yeah, exactly. But you're already way, way, way too late.
But listen, you start from where you are. But yes, if you have optimally, you can start much earlier. And that's kind of what we like to talk about, Chris, is that, regulatory and reimbursement strategies are just table stakes. You have to have both of these in your planning well before you even launch your pivotal study. If you're developing that kind of seminal data, you've got to be intimately involved and working together and collaboratively. Really, it's clinical, regulatory, and the reimbursement folks. And I can sort of give you a couple of examples of.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, because I think the other thing that we talk about in this podcast all the time is, and I want to bring it to this, is the product launch and the sales aspects of it. So
Right.
I think, and one of the things that you and I have talked about, and I know we're hand in hand on, is that the early sales and reimbursement, they go hand in hand. You can't do one without the other. And what often happens, well, a couple things. One is, this idea of getting to getting to authorization and having this big celebration. That's, and you should celebrate that win, but that's 90% of your risk is still in front of you.
Right.
And this is this is why this is advanced cards, because the two big things that your risk is, one is the reimbursement risk, and the second thing is the sales and the market development risk. and they go hand in hand. So let's you were going to say so. You're going to tell us one of your stories. You're going to talk about some stories. Go ahead and take us there.
Yeah, well, I was just going to talk a little bit about why, the FDA clearance and your FDA label may not get you where you need to be in terms of your reimbursement objectives. And
Okay, and let's couch this a little bit. If you wait until you get FDA clearance and you really haven't started mapping on your reimbursement strategy and your plan prior to that, you can miss some things. Is that kind of where we're going here?
right, exactly. Not only can you miss some things, but you can really create your own roadblock and prevent yourself from moving off the dime. This is sort of, at a higher level conceptually, but an example is if your FDA label limits you in some way to what payers are looking to understand or looking to what you hope payers will cover about for your technology. So, for example, early on days in AI analysis, we saw FDA indications with clearance for post-processing analysis, for example.
Yeah.
That was the terminology that FDA used because, that was what it had always been. Well, there are rules under the Medicare payment system where post-processing is not separately paid for. And so out of the gate, you have an FDA clearance for a product that has no ability for payment.
Right.
There's no mechanism by which Medicare would pay for it. So that's a big, big problem that literally you cannot get past the front door with your FDA clearance to go and try and get payment.
Well, not only do you not get past the front door, but you actually, by not planning ahead and working these things in parallel, you've actually created yourself a roadblock.
Exactly. You have literally, yes, you have closed your own door
Well,
and there's no window.
Right. And it'll appear like, oh, this happened to us. But this is something you're telling me from a reimbursement standpoint. We can actually plan ahead for this. And so tell us a little bit more about that.
So what happened? The company literally had to go back to FDA and ask for a different clearance indication. And the consequence of that is time to market, right? Everything is about time to market. You're burning cash. You've got a map of when you want to get to market and what your sales ramp is going to look like. It's tied to hiring people. It's tied to everything is tied to that.
You've set
Now
all
you find yourself
expectations with your investors based on that, right?
absolutely. And now you find yourself going, okay, well, we're going to need another 90 days at least to go back to FDA and so forth. So that's a big learning that I don't think anyone has repeated that mistake since.
So did that company actually go back and get it changed?
Yes.
And how long did it take? Did it take 90 days or longer?
Honestly, I don't know how long it took, but it was game changing for the company. They literally had to start again with FDA.
Okay, so that's kind of the risk of waiting too long, right? Is there any that's one example. Is there other risks that we should be aware of from a reimbursement standpoint?
Oh, there's so many risks. One of my key points that I hope people take away from this is that the reimbursement landscape and the reimbursement pathway is not linear. And by that, I mean, so it's not linear, but the results are binary. So you get to yes or no. Those are your choices.
Oh, right.
So the reason that the reimbursement strategy is not linear in the way that FDA strategy might be linear or your clinical trials pathway is linear is because once you go through certain gated steps, you keep moving forward. With a reimbursement or market access strategy, you've got three moving parts that you have to manage, which is coverage for the technology and the service, right? Where does it fit in the clinical pathway? Is there a mechanism to report it, meaning a code or codes? And what is the mechanism for payment, meaning is it going to be separately paid or somehow encapsulated in a larger procedure or code or mechanism that doesn't give anybody any extra payment for using your technology, which creates a tremendous challenge on your pricing strategy.
Yeah, I was just reviewing an SBRR grant for a client the other day, and the comment they had interviewed the company, and the founder had said that, oh yeah, we fit under a bundle code, we're fine. It's like, fit under a bundle code, we're fine. You just killed your company unless you have an independent economic value proposition that shows you can save how much you're going to charge for your device. You've just said you're going to fit into the existing payment, and it's going to cost them more to get your technology. you've just killed your company.
Absolutely.
I suspect for that founder, he didn't even know what he was saying.
And that's a lot of what we see is that, unfortunately, not knowing how to anticipate some of these very, elusive pitfalls.
Right.
You need a guide. You need someone to help you get through some of this stuff.
And I would guess, I would guess some of this stuff is pretty straightforward, and if you catch it early, you can address it easily. But then there's other stuff that, and I know this from experience, some of the stuff around reimbursement, especially around getting a new code, it's just hard work, and it's going to take time anyway. And now you're talking about companies adding more risk, more delays, more costs that is also unnecessary on top of something that's already hard, challenging, expensive, and time consuming already, right?
Exactly. And what's even harder than all of that is that in order to affect all of those goals of coverage, codes, and payment, the company only has so much control over all of those things. What it needs to do is it needs to activate and engage stakeholders who have skin in the game, who are interested in seeing this technology, take root and grow in the marketplace. So we're talking about physicians, specialty societies, hospitals. We're talking about what I like to call unimpeachable sources that when payers look at the information and the evidence around your technology, it's not just your clinical data that's published that they consider, sponsored, industry sponsored studies, but there are perhaps technology assessments that have looked at your technology and given it, strong indication, or there are guidelines that include your technology. Some of these things take time, obviously, and aren't available at launch, but these are all things that you can lay out on a timeline and work toward, recognizing that, again, we're talking about time to market. How quickly can we get to the first sale, incremental sales, subsequent sales, repeat sales, and to give physicians and hospitals some assurance that the cost of this new technology will be reimbursable to them in time, so that they can decide to contract with you and pay you for your product.
Right. So that early on, you better be preparing. And this is where it starts, the reimbursement starts overlapping with the market development and the sales strategy. You go try to sell to a hospital or you sell to a clinical practice, and you don't have a reimbursement plan in place for how they're going to get paid and coverage and how much, and what percentage of patients are going to get covered. If you don't know what that is going in, you're really setting yourself up for a challenge. And this is where, and I love what you said earlier about reimbursement's not linear. There's things that you get to, and then there's probably some things that you then have to then churn through to figure out. Sometimes you go down the path and you have to come back a little bit and then go down another path because you're kind of testing different things.
Exactly right.
What do you mean by non-linear?
That's exactly what I mean. That sometimes one path, you go down a path to, perhaps you want to use existing codes, for example. Let's just use that as an example. Right. There are existing codes that describe your procedure. They exist because you're entering a market that has an established set of treatments for that marketplace. And so there are established codes for physicians who want to bill that service. And depending on where the service is performed, if your price is such that it's significantly higher than your competitors who are already on the market, and the code has been priced at that to reflect prior pricing, you're going to be challenged. Your customers are going to be challenged to break even or not lose money if your price point is higher than your competitors. And so you may have the coverage, you may have great evidence, but if you're looking to fit into existing codes to shorten that path to market, you may find that you have to sacrifice on your price point.
Yes.
So,
this is where the overlap with the go-to-market strategy and the market development, it becomes really important, because if you look at the reimbursement, and that could be a legitimate path, right? I'm going to use an existing code. That means right out of the gate, we're going to get paid, which is a big feather in your cap. But I'm going to be priced 50% or 100% higher than my competitors. I better be figuring out from a market development standpoint, engaging with the stakeholders, building it into my clinical trial evidence generation, that I have an economic value proposition that can offset my increase in cost. And I can create even get down to a detailed ROI.
Right.
That shows that, okay, listen, it's going to cost you. I'm going to I'm going to cost you an extra 50% over what you're paying now, but I'm going to save you 150% over here. And here's the return, and develop that compelling, here's why you pay more, here's how you get that back. And the other thing, and you said this earlier, is that regulatory is that's just the stakes to play the game. It doesn't get you actually even in the game. It just gets you to the starting point of the game. That's the same thing around authorization. Getting clinical value, like clinical evidence. 20 years ago when I was doing this, I'm sure this is the same for you, Adi. Clinical evidence was enough for you to get doctors and hospitals to buy your product.
That's right.
And over time, we can develop the economic. Today, the table stakes are just the clinical evidence. You can't sell with clinical evidence alone today. You have to have the reimbursement strategy that wraps into the economic value proposition that gives you the economic ROI. You have to go to market with that today. And in days past, we didn't need that. It's changed dramatically.
Absolutely. And remember, the example that you just gave, you were talking about demonstrating an ROI to the providers who need to purchase your product, but are getting reimbursed an amount that isn't incrementally more than what they could for a competing technology that's already established in the market. They already know how to use. And so you're creating a hurdle for yourself. Now, let's talk about 510K approval or clearances from FDA, because those are predominantly the most common. But payers have told me time and time again that a 510K with a non-inferiority trial data presented to them tells them that what you're saying is my product is no better than the products already on the market, and therefore I don't expect to be paid any more than what you're already paying.
Right.
And the payers, they might say that's fine, and we will start to make this available. However, when you take that argument back to your customers where your price is 50% higher, now you've got to create an ROI for your physicians or hospitals, those stakeholders. And so it's critical when you start your reimbursement planning early, again, with your regulatory team and your clinical team, you need to think about who is going to use my product and who is going to buy my product, who is going to be on the financial hook for the cost associated with this product, this service. And not only just that, but also think about it in the broader context of a total episode of care, because payers more and more are asking us to show them the cost differences over a year or 2 years if we integrate a new technology. How does that change the cost curve for that payer over the next year or two? It may mean that they'll pay more today if they can see that they're going to have long-term savings over 1 or 2 years. It may mean that they will happily pay the same amount and let the providers deal with those problems, right? So you need to understand that. Who is paying for this? Who is carrying the financial burden and the financial risk for purchasing this technology, spending the money on it, and not potentially getting the value that they want?
Yeah, one of the things I found in that arena that's interesting, I love you talking about that, is that I almost find that the ROI has got to be immediate now, like 6 months to a year, both for the provider, well, not both, for the provider, the clinician, the provider, if it's different than the clinician, right, the facility, as well as the payer. Because, I mean, you go in, I see this happen all the time, where the values 5-10 years down the road that they accumulate value. There's no one buys that type of product anymore. And the payers, they don't even keep let me ask that. What's the window for a payer for an ROI cycle for something like that?
Well, they usually tell you 1 to 2 years. Okay. They continue to, the prevailing theory is that, you have 20% turnover in your membership every year, which means that every 5 years your membership completely turns over. Really, the reality is a lot more like it's 20% that churns and 80% tends to stay stable. But even if it were 20% turnover a year, the people you're getting into your plan are relatively similar to the people who may have left your plan, right? And so the reality for payers is that's an argument that they'll pose to say, we want ROI within 1 to 2 years because we may not be responsible for this person's, this employer contract, and therefore this employee, they won't be on our books for beyond that time period. But again, they're going to get a new contract with a new employer, and they're going to have the same issues with that same patient population. So
got it.
The reality is, though, a year to two minimum, showing them an ROI in that period. In the shorter time frame, the better.
Right.
A lot of our medical technologies are used, in a perioperative environment, and so you can see some fairly short term returns, um, you know, in reducing, for example, ER admissions or other visits, and being able to demonstrate very quickly to the payer, very plausibly, look, once this patient has this level of intervention, they're not going to be repeat visitors, frequent flyers at the ER or at their doctor's office. And so you can calibrate those costs. But if you're talking about a long-term, treatment for a chronic condition, it does get a little more difficult to demonstrate that value early on. So again, important to think about early on, to think about, do we need to think about running any health economic analysis at the same time as our clinical study so that we can publish to at least demonstrate where the costs accumulate and where they shift.
Let's talk about that for a minute, because I think, clinical studies are interesting, especially, and what most people associate clinical studies is you have to have the clinical studies supporting the regulatory submission. I even talked to a regulatory firm just recently about this, where that's all they focus on. But I see it on the market development side, engaging with the key stakeholders in the buying process. It completely gets missed during the clinical trial stage. And then you have to go gather this data after you get clearance. And I think that's it. But you talked about this, is that building payer endpoint or outcomes into those clinical trials that are for the regulatory trials. Tell me what you mean by payer outpoints, number one, and number two, give me a little idea. How often do you see people do that for the portion of it well?
Yeah. So we always want to collect data once and use it for multiple applications, right? And so a robust clinical trial that collects data beyond what FDA is requiring, but that a company can use with their payers in the future after approval, is a really smart way to invest in your clinical strategy. And so I'm talking about collecting endpoints like costs of all other resource use associated with the procedure, either new or that are replaced. So capturing the cost of how many follow-up visits did the patient need to come in for, what other services did they need to have, or what services were avoided, for example, emergency room visits, or they were able to stop taking certain expensive pharmaceuticals or other injectables with a longer term chronic intervention. And so it's really looking at some of those economic endpoints. But it is also thinking about, the value to the patient and the value to, some of the quality of life measures are important. FDA doesn't concern themselves with that because it's not about safe and effective. What payers care for is medical necessity. Does the patient need this particular intervention given their specific set of clinical circumstances?
Yep.
How will they be better after having this intervention versus what's available today? Yep. And so those are the kinds of
just not clinically, functionally, economically,
right.
And
activities of daily living,
emotionally.
Right? Exactly. Critically important. And I would say that, a good watch out for companies with pre-FDA approval is that if you haven't spoken to payers before you submit or have your QSOB or follow-up discussions with FDA, you're making potentially a mistake. You should have some payer input into your strategy, your FDA path, long before you go to FDA. And don't be afraid to go speak to payers multiple times over the course of your development, your clinical development, your FDA pathway, and tell them where you are. Tell them what you're finding in your studies to the extent that you can, and get their feedback on how much information do you need? How does this answer questions you have? What questions have I not answered that you might have once this is FDA cleared? Be proactive and reach out to payers. There are lots of folks who can help you do that. And CMS, certainly you can talk to CMS, and they're a little bit easier to meet with, and get some of that insight into what the payer market will demand of you, so you can build that into your clinical trial before.
And from the market development side of it, you need to be talking to your clinicians about all that. You need to be talking to your buyer stakeholders. You
Exactly.
got to be talking. This is kind of an odd one, and you probably know this. I'm sure you know this as well. Talk about the people that are actually implementing your technology in that environment. Figure out what changes in the workflow have to take place, because
Exactly.
those are all costs at some level, whether it's time, effort, or even economic costs
Right.
associated with all those things. Those are all things, and I love that you said that talking to payers before the Q sub meeting. Not everybody on this, probably most people on here are going to know what a Q sub, but that's long before you file for your authorization. It might be multiple years before that. Let's talk about that. We've talked about the challenges and one of the problems. When should people be building reimbursement strategy and planning and assessment into their product development, company development, market development
Yeah.
planning?
Well, hopefully the product that's being developed isn't something that's been handed over the wall from the engineer saying we have this great ability to do this now, but rather the problem, the solution that you've developed has been in response to identifying a key clinical problem that you're solving for. And once you've got that piece nailed down and you can articulate what is the problem what is the unmet medical need that we're solving for with this modality, then you have a way to take that message in-house and understand what kind of clinical evidence you need to develop. Once you've thought about the clinical evidence you need to develop, then you need to take that to the payers to have a conversation, say, this is the problem we're trying to solve. Here's a solution we've developed. It will address the problem in the following ways with the expected outcomes that we report according to this. Does that resonate? And if the answer is that's not a problem we're worried about fixing. We've got
Yeah.
plenty of solutions to that problem. We aren't going to be looking at this with any sense of urgency once you come to market. That's important to know, right? And
Wow.
payers will tell you that.
That's
If you ask the
big.
question the right way.
That's like going to a surgeon and saying, "Hey, listen, here we got a technology. I'd love you to use it." Oh, we're completely happy with all of our solutions. Say 100% of our patients are happy. We're happy. We're not looking for anything to change there,
Right.
right?
And I mean, it's probably not ever 100% of
No.
anything, but the reality is that getting a new technology, embedded into the healthcare pathway, as you said, between the workflow, the new costs, the new education that has to happen, is a huge lift. It's a set of
Yep.
different exercises.
Yep.
And if the demand isn't there for what you're offering as a solution, that
Yep.
headwind is going to follow you everywhere you go. And
And
so,
you see that same type of analogy with the payers as you do with the providers, as you do with the clinicians themselves. I see that when I'm doing this type of really early work for customers on the clinician side of things, if it's not on their top 1, 2, 3 daily problems, like things that keep them up at night, you're not even going to get on their radar.
that's right.
Um,
That's right.
so Adi, we have an interesting question I just put up on the screen here. Someone from one of our, they'd love to hear more about companies choosing the wrong type of sales teams for technologies that don't have reimbursements in place. Wow, that's a mouthful. It's an interesting question. So let me ask you this: when you, and this is post launch. We're kind of focused on pre launch here, pre authorization. But let me pose this one. How important is once you're launched and you gotta, let's say you're going after a new code and you're working on the code and you got to work closely with your clinicians to get early reimbursement. How important is the team that's calling on those, either the hospital practice? How important is that team to being successful in the reimbursement?
Absolutely. Well, I think if your sales team, if your customer facing teams of any customer, though, whether it's the physician customer, the hospital, or the payer, don't have a clear sense or understanding of what the pathway, what the reimbursement is today, or what the pathway to that reimbursement is, they don't necessarily need to be the ones to communicate it to the customers, because there's a fine line at which sales folks should not be talking about reimbursement and coverage, but they need to understand it and be able to say, I understand the questions you're asking. I need to put you in touch with people who can answer them for you fully. Without that context and understanding, there's just going to be confusion. Words are just going to pass in the night. And so the provider may be asking a certain question. The sales folks may not understand the complexity, or not even the complexity, but just the the essence of the question, or why it's important to that
Yeah.
provider, and
Yeah.
and not be able to answer it. I work with lots and lots of companies that are on a pathway to reimbursement and have sales folks who are out in the market working very diligently, and they struggle with. I get to a point, and all I say is, at this point, we don't have a code, or there's not payment. What do I do then? And
Yeah.
I know you're going to be talking about that in your next chat, and that's really where you need a field support. But you can't ask your sales folks to solve that problem for you. You can only ask them to communicate what the current status is. But
Yep.
my experience is that when the sales team understands the pathway and they understand the timeline and get like regular updates about what's happening and how we're moving towards that goal, they can incorporate that and leverage that into their communication. And there are lots of early adopters out there. There are physicians and hospitals who like to be first to market with new technology,
Yep. Yep.
and they're willing to work through the challenges of coverage and payment.
But you've just pointed at two things that most traditional sales reps aren't used to dealing with. One is reimbursement. Usually they're not, that's not a world where the sales rep is 90, 95, 98, 99. I don't know what the percentage of MedTech sales reps have never sold a product that you had to work through the reimbursement strategy with. That's number one. And number two, early adopters. That's not the terminology of most salespeople. And I think that's one of the things I love about this question, is we talk about this a lot of times on this podcast. Who's the right salespeople for these really disruptive early technologies?
Right.
And there's a term out there. It was codified in a Harvard Business Review article called the Sales Learning Curve. And they talked about Renaissance reps. These types of sales reps that are comfortable with ambiguity, complexity, not having all the answers, but still being able to function. That's not your typical sales rep. And it's a very, this early stage of launching disruptive technology, which working reimbursement into the front end of that, it's a very fluid, you've got to have reps that can kind of function on the feet, reps that are much more consultative, and even beyond consultative, actually get in there and are problem solvers.
Yes, this might date me a little bit, but IBM used to call them their super blue suitors, the guys who would show, and they were usually guys who would show up, to the meetings with the CFOs and CEOs in the C-suite, because they were the consultative, problem-solving kind of folks who could look at an enterprise and try to solve the problem, even though it may be about a specific payment on a specific technology. They could have that conversation in the broader context. And so as you're building your market development, you may choose to have one or two of those folks on your team for your early adopter accounts, as well as to build your sales team to be able to go, once you've crossed that bridge and you've got the payments in place and so forth, to go out there and develop the bulk of the marketplace.
Yeah, and if it's not just regulatory, if it's not just reimbursement, it's if you're truly doing something disruptive, you actually will fail without these type of sales force. So we're running a little bit over here. We do all the time. Adi, let me just share. I had put in the description the 10x ROI. We're gonna give people a 10x ROI, and here's what it is. 90% of your risk happens post-launch or post-authorization. So the risk of MedTech technology is not on the product development side. It's not on the regulatory side. It's 90% of the risk is wrapped up around this reimbursement and this early market entry, and how do you go from that first sale to scale. So any investment, pre-authorization, any dollar invested on de-risking that piece, which is what Adi and I have been talking about for the last 30 minutes here, it gives you a 10x return for every dollar invested on regulatory or product development. That is just a fact. So any de-risking, and that's what we've been talking about. We've been talking about here the challenges if you don't address those things early, and the problems you can create for yourself, but then also what you can do to start addressing those things earlier. So Adi, this has been absolutely brilliant. I love doing this with you. I hope you had a good time.
A great time. This is wonderful. I love to talk about this, and happy to answer questions. I know we're short of time, but let's do it again. It's wonderful.
I was going to say the same thing. Let's find the time when we can do a follow-up one, and we'll figure out a fun topic. For everybody on the call still, We've got the next one. We have MedTech 401 reimbursement 401. We're gonna focus on post authorization, which is when we're actually selling and how reimbursement and selling work together in the early stages of a product launch. So, and we're gonna have Kim Norton back for that one. But indeed, you and I will do this again. We'll just have to figure out when it is and what we're going to talk about next time. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much. It's been wonderful.
Great. Dee, stay on. Everybody have a great day and have a wonderful weekend.
Bye, everyone.